The silent factory, whispers in the night. Eisenfeld was a quiet, forgotten town nestled in the heart of Germany, where fog rolled in from the hills and the streets emptied after sunset. It wasn't always this way. Decades ago, the town thrived thanks to its massive textile factory. The factory had employed hundreds of workers, its machines humming day and night. Until one day, everything stopped. The factory shut down without warning. Workers disappeared, some without a trace, others found in states too gruesome to speak of. Those who remained refused to talk about it, their lips sealed in fear. The building was abandoned, its gates locked. Over time, the town learned to live without it, but one thing remained. At night, when the wind was still, people swore they could hear the faint hum of machines, and whispers coming from the empty halls. No one dared to go inside. Until Daniel Grayson came along. The Forbidden Investigation. Daniel was a British documentary filmmaker, known for exploring abandoned places across Europe. He had filmed crumbling castles in Scotland, underground bunkers in Poland, and eerie ghost towns in Ukraine. But when he heard about the Eisenfeld factory, something about it sent a chill through him, which only made him want to explore it more. The locals warned him. They pleaded with him not to enter. "You don't understand," an elderly bartender told him in a hushed voice. "The factory, it doesn't like visitors." But warnings were meant to be ignored. On a cold November night, Daniel packed his cameras, a flashlight, and a crowbar just in case, and made his way to the factory. The massive structure loomed before him, its windows dark and empty, its towering chimneys long dead. The rusted gates, which should have been locked, swung open with an eerie creak. As he stepped inside, the wind died, and the air thickened with an unnatural silence. He was alone. Or so he thought. The first signs. Inside, dust coated the floors, yet the air carried an odd, metallic scent. The machines stood still, their gears frozen with rust. Faded safety posters still clung to the walls, warning workers of dangers long forgotten. Daniel set up his first camera in the main hall, letting it record as he wandered deeper. His voice echoed unnaturally as he spoke into his handheld recorder. This factory was abandoned in 1971. Reports claim workers disappeared mysteriously, and yet, no explanation was ever given. His words felt hollow in the vast emptiness. Then, just as he passed a row of workbenches, a faint whisper. Daniel froze. It had been soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably real. He swung his flashlight around. Nothing. A trick of the wind, maybe. Or his mind playing tricks on him. Then came the click. Daniel turned to see one of his cameras, a fully charged, high-end model, had turned off on its own. He exhaled sharply. Technical malfunction. It had happened before. No big deal. But as he reached for it, another whisper. This time, right behind him. The Office of Secrets. Daniel spun around, but the room was empty. Yet the air had changed. It felt charged, as if the factory itself was watching him. Gritting his teeth, he pressed forward. If there were any answers to be found, they'd be in the factory manager's office on the second floor. That's where the final records would be. The metal staircase groaned under his weight as he ascended. At the top, a door stood slightly ajar, revealing a room frozen in time. Papers were scattered across the desk, a rusted telephone sat untouched, and on the far wall, a row of workers' uniforms hung, their fabric stiff with age. And stained with something dark. Daniel's breath hitched. The stains were deep, soaked into the fibers. They weren't just dirt. They were blood. A metallic click sounded from below. Another camera had turned off. Then came the whispers again, louder now, as if dozens of voices were murmuring all at once. Daniel backed toward the desk, his fingers trembling as he reached for the filing cabinet. If something had happened to the workers, the truth had to be recorded somewhere. He yanked open the top drawer. Inside were stacks of employee files, each one labeled with a worker's name, position, and... His stomach twisted. Each file ended with the same words, stamped in bold red ink. Employee terminated, body not recovered. Daniel's pulse pounded in his ears. He flipped through them rapidly. Dozens. No, hundreds of files, all saying the same thing. Something had happened here. Something monstrous. And the factory didn't want him to leave with that knowledge. The machines waked. A deep, resonant thud shook the building. Then another. And another. Daniel barely had time to react before the machines roared to life. Looms clattered. Conveyor belts groaned into motion. Rusted gears spun with an unnatural fluidity. The factory, which had been dead for decades, was working again. And in the dim glow of his flashlight, Daniel saw them. The workers. Figures, barely visible, flickered in and out of existence. Shadowy silhouettes moved methodically, their heads bowed, their hands mimicking the motions they had in life. One of them turned toward him. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. It had no eyes. No features. Just a hollow, gaping mouth. And then it spoke, in a voice that was both one and many. The factory never closed. The escape. Daniel didn't hesitate. He bolted down the stairs, heart hammering, shadows closing in around him. The walls shifted, stretching, warping, turning the building into a labyrinth of metal and darkness. The whispers grew deafening. Hands, cold, unseen, grabbed at him. He hit the door with his full weight once, twice, before it burst open, spilling him onto the cold ground outside. For several seconds, he lay there, gasping, staring up at the factory. The machines had stopped. The shadows were gone. But as he turned to his camera, his one remaining, undamaged camera, his stomach clenched. The footage was still recording. And in the final seconds before he had escaped, the camera had captured one last image. The factory door, slightly open. And a pair of bloody handprints pressed against the glass. The factory still stands. Daniel never spoke of that night. He left Eisenfeld before sunrise, abandoning his documentary and vowing never to return. The factory remains untouched. Silent by day. But at night, when the wind dies and the town falls quiet, the whispers begin again. And if you dare step inside, the machines might start running once more. The forgotten hospital, a shadow in the dark hallways. It was a hospital that time had abandoned. The crumbling structure stood on the outskirts of a forgotten city, its windows shattered, its walls covered in layers of dust and decay. Once a beacon of healing, it had become a place of nightmares, a sight people refused to speak of. Lucas, an urban explorer, had heard the stories, strange sounds echoing in the halls, shadows that moved when no one was looking, and most chilling of all, the disappearance of those who dared to enter. But he was not deterred. He had explored countless abandoned buildings, each more eerie than the last. This would be no different, or so he thought. Armed with only a flashlight and a camera, Lucas stepped through the rusted front doors. The air was thick with the stench of mildew and something else, something foul, almost rotten. The beam of his flashlight revealed the peeling paint on the walls, medical charts scattered across the floor, and overturned gurneys that lay forgotten like relics of an unfinished tragedy. The deeper he went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Faint whispers drifted through the corridors, so soft he could almost convince himself they were in his mind. Almost. Then he saw it, a shadow, darker than the surrounding darkness, standing at the end of the hallway. It did not move. It did not waver. Lucas raised his camera, but the moment he clicked the shutter, the light flickered, and the shadow was gone. A chill ran down his spine. He turned around, suddenly aware of how deep he had ventured. The entrance was far behind him now, swallowed by the maze of twisting corridors. A distant thud echoed through the halls, followed by the unmistakable squeak of a gurney's wheels rolling across the floor. Lucas held his breath, listening. The sound stopped. Silence, thick and suffocating, settled around him. Then a whisper, right next to his ear, "You shouldn't be here." He spun around, his flashlight shaking. The hallway was empty. But he knew he was not alone. A scraping noise pulled his gaze to a nearby door, slightly ajar. He stepped closer, pushing it open. Inside was an old operating room. Rusted surgical tools lay on a stained table. The air was thick with the scent of something foul. And then he saw the writing on the wall, drawn in something dark and dried, "Leave now." Something moved in the corner of the room. Lucas turned, but before he could react, the lights flickered wildly. Shadows twisted and danced, and then darkness. A scream, his own, echoed through the hospital. The camera hit the floor with a crack. His flashlight flickered back to life just in time for him to see it. The shadow, no longer standing still, but moving. Rushing toward him. Lucas turned and ran, his heart hammering in his chest. The whispers became a chorus, pleading, warning, screaming. The hallways twisted, stretching endlessly. No matter which way he turned, the exit never came closer. And then he saw them, figures in hospital gowns, faces hollow, eyes empty. They stood in every doorway, watching him. The shadow loomed behind him, its presence suffocating. A cold hand closed around his wrist. And the world went black. Days later, Lucas's camera was found just outside the hospital's entrance. The last photo it had captured was of the shadow, a towering mass of darkness, its featureless face inches from the lens. Lucas was never found. Weeks passed, and rumors spread that the hospital had claimed yet another soul. Some believed Lucas had become one of the restless spirits, doomed to wander the dark hallways forever. Others claimed to hear his voice in the recordings left on his camera, whispers pleading for help, lost in the static. A team of investigators, drawn by his story, decided to venture into the abandoned hospital. Armed with motion sensors, EVP recorders, and night vision cameras, they hoped to uncover the truth. As they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them. Their equipment flickered, failing one by one. And in the far end of the hallway, where no light could reach, a familiar shadow stood waiting. One by one, they disappeared, their screams swallowed by the darkness. The hospital, as always, kept its secrets. The city remained silent, pretending the hospital did not exist. But those who dared to approach at night swore they could still hear the echo of footsteps, the distant sound of a gurney rolling through the halls, and the faintest whisper of a voice, calling from the shadows, warning them to turn back before it was too late. Months later, another explorer named Sarah became obsessed with Lucas's disappearance. She studied his footage, traced his path, and finally gathered her courage to enter the hospital herself. Unlike Lucas, she came prepared with extra lights, spare batteries, and a friend waiting outside with a two-way radio. As Sarah stepped inside, the air thickened, pressing against her lungs like an unseen force. The radio crackled. "Sarah, do you copy?" "I'm inside," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. She retraced Lucas's steps, finding the same overturned gurneys, the same eerie silence. But this time, something was different. There were footprints, fresh ones, leading deeper inside. Her flashlight flickered as she followed the trail, her hands trembling. The footprints ended at the operating room. The door, which had been ajar in Lucas's footage, was now shut. She pushed it open, and her breath hitched. The room was exactly as it had been, rusted surgical tools, the foul stench, the writing on the wall. But something new had appeared, a photograph, pinned to the wall with a scalpel. It was a picture of Lucas. His eyes were hollow, his expression frozen in silent terror. And scrawled beneath it, in that same dark substance, "Join US." Sarah turned, her pulse hammering. The shadows in the corners moved. The whispering started. Her radio crackled wildly, her friend's voice breaking through. "Sarah, get out now. Something's moving in there." The door slammed shut behind her. And then, she screamed. The old mansion, who knocked on the door? The rain poured relentlessly as Thomas drove down the winding road leading to the abandoned mansion. He had inherited the estate from a distant relative he barely remembered, and though he had no intention of living in the decrepit house, curiosity got the best of him. He wanted to see it with his own eyes before deciding whether to sell it. As he pulled up to the towering structure, its once grand facade was crumbling, the windows shattered in places, and vines snaked their way up the stone walls. The place exuded an eerie presence, and Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. Taking a deep breath, he grabbed his flashlight and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the wooden floor creaked under his weight. The mansion had been left untouched for years, yet it felt as if someone had just been there. Furniture was covered with white sheets, old chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and an antique grandfather clock stood in the corner, frozen at midnight. As he explored the dimly lit corridors, a sudden, loud knock echoed through the house. His heart pounded. He turned toward the heavy wooden front door, but when he reached it and flung it open, there was no one outside, only the howling wind and the relentless rain. Shaking his head, he muttered to himself, "Probably just the wind." But then it happened again. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. This time, his hands trembled as he grasped the doorknob and yanked the door open. Again, no one was there. Feeling a deep unease settle in, he decided to check the upper floors. Perhaps there was a rational explanation, an old pipe knocking in the walls or the wind playing tricks. But as he climbed the grand staircase, a whisper brushed against his ear, so faint he almost doubted he heard it. "Leave." His breath hitched. He swung his flashlight wildly, illuminating the empty hallways. The darkness felt alive, shifting in the corners of his vision. He forced himself to move forward, pushing open doors to empty bedrooms filled with antique furniture and forgotten memories. Then, another knock, this time, from inside the house. Thomas spun around, his pulse hammering. The sound had come from the study, a room with an old oak desk and walls lined with dusty bookshelves. A single candle flickered on the desk, though he was sure he hadn't lit anything. As he stepped inside, a gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. Panic surged through him as he rattled the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Then, he heard it, the slow creak of a chair being pulled out. He turned slowly. A figure sat at the desk, its form shrouded in shadows. It was featureless, like a dense void in the shape of a person. It lifted one hand and tapped 3 times on the desk. Knock. 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 Thomas staggered back, his mind screaming for an escape. The figure stood, its presence towering and oppressive. A whisper slithered through the air, chilling him to the bone. "You shouldn't have come." The candle flickered violently before going out, plunging the room into darkness. A cold breath grazed his neck, and the last thing he heard before everything went silent was one final, resounding knock. The room seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with an unnatural pressure. Thomas fumbled for his phone, but the screen remained black. The darkness deepened, almost tangible, like ink swirling around him. Then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. His breath hitched. The sensation of unseen eyes bore into him, making his skin crawl. He reached for the door handle once more, yanking it with all his strength. It refused to move. The figure, now inches away, loomed over him, its whisper turning into a low, guttural growl. "You should have stayed away." With a sudden force, Thomas was shoved backward. His body collided with the desk, sending books crashing to the floor. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as he desperately searched for another way out. The window. He lunged toward it, struggling to open the warped wooden frame. The knocking resumed this time, from inside the walls. Knock. 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 A deep, resonating vibration rattled the entire house, as if something was trying to claw its way out from within. The whispering turned to distorted murmurs, voices overlapping, filling the air with an unintelligible cacophony. Thomas felt his sanity slipping. Then, he saw it. The reflection in the window didn't match his own. It was the figure, tall, looming, its hollow face inches from his shoulder. A twisted grin formed on its void-like features, and the last thing Thomas saw before he lost consciousness was its hand slowly reaching toward him. The abandoned school, footsteps in the empty halls. In the heart of a small, forgotten town stood the old Hargrove School. Time had weathered its walls, and the world outside had moved on, leaving this once vibrant institution to crumble. The windows were shattered, the doors long broken, and the halls echoing with memories of children who had long since disappeared. Some said it was just an abandoned school, but the locals knew better. It was something far darker. Elliot, a freelance journalist always on the lookout for a new story, had heard the rumors. The whispers about Hargrove School echoed throughout the town, strange noises at night, fleeting shadows in the windows, and most chilling of all, footsteps in the empty halls. These tales were enough to spark his curiosity. A few quick searches online revealed no articles about the school, only brief mentions of its closing years ago, after a fire had ravaged the building. But no one could explain the stories. No one would dare to go inside. Determined to uncover the truth, Elliot made his way to the school one evening, armed with nothing but a camera, a flashlight, and his unshakable skepticism. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape, he approached the massive, decaying structure. The iron gates creaked in protest as he pushed them open, their rusted hinges groaning under the strain. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and a chill ran down his spine. It felt as though the building had been waiting for him. Inside, the school was a maze of broken walls and forgotten classrooms. Desks were overturned, and papers lay scattered across the floors like remnants of a life that had once been. But it wasn't the state of disrepair that unsettled Elliot, it was the silence. It was the kind of silence that presses in on you, wrapping around your chest, suffocating you. Elliot ventured deeper into the heart of the school, each step making the floorboards creak beneath him. He made his way down a narrow hallway, the light from his flashlight casting eerie shadows that danced on the walls. The temperature seemed to drop with each passing moment, the air growing heavy with something he couldn't quite place. That's when he heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, like the soft tapping of footsteps on the dusty floor. Elliot froze, his breath caught in his throat. His eyes darted to the end of the hall, but there was nothing there, only the looming darkness. His mind raced. It was impossible. The school had been empty for years. But the footsteps grew louder. Step. Pause. Step. Pause. Elliot's heart raced as he lifted his camera, instinctively wanting to capture whatever was happening. But the shadows at the end of the hallway shifted, and Elliot felt a cold breeze rush past him, extinguishing the flashlight. He cursed under his breath, fumbling for another battery. The footsteps didn't stop. They only grew closer. Then, as if guided by some unseen force, Elliot turned down another corridor. The walls were cracked and stained, but it wasn't the damage that caught his attention. It was the faint outline of a figure, too tall to be human, too thin, with arms that stretched unnaturally long, dragging behind it like the remnants of something decayed. The figure stood motionless at the end of the hallway, staring at him with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce into his very soul. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure slowly began to move toward him, its footsteps heavy and deliberate. The sound echoed in the hollow silence of the school, sending chills through Elliot's body. His breath was shallow, the weight of dread suffocating him. He turned to flee, but the hallway stretched impossibly long, and the doorways seemed to vanish. His flashlight flickered, casting brief glimpses of the thing behind him. It was getting closer, too close. In a blind panic, Elliot rushed down a staircase, the footsteps still following, now accompanied by whispers, soft, unintelligible whispers that seemed to come from all directions. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very building was alive, closing in on him. He stumbled into the gymnasium, gasping for breath. The room was vast, filled with shadows and remnants of broken equipment. But in the center of the floor, there was something that made his blood run cold, a chalkboard, untouched by time. He had scrawled with words in red, jagged letters. "Leave now. You are not alone." Elliot's heart hammered in his chest, but before he could process what he was seeing, the gym door slammed shut, trapping him inside. The footsteps continued, now echoing from every corner of the room, as though the very walls themselves were closing in on him. Then, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The shadows on the walls began to twist, forming faces, pale, gaunt faces that seemed to reach out toward him. The temperature dropped further, and Elliot's breath fogged in the freezing air. The figure appeared once more, standing in front of him. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, as if it had been waiting for him to arrive. Elliot tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The footsteps stopped. The figure raised one bony finger, pointing toward the exit. The message was clear: leave, or join us. With every ounce of strength he had left, Elliot bolted toward the door. He could feel the weight of unseen hands tugging at his clothes, pulling him back into the darkness. The footsteps followed, faster now, closing in on him. In a desperate bid, he crashed through the door, tumbling into the night air. He didn't stop running until he reached his car, his hands trembling as he fumbled for his keys. His breath came in ragged gasps, but when he finally got in and locked the doors, he dared to look back. The school stood in silence, its windows like empty eyes staring out at him. He was free, but the echoes of the footsteps, the whispers, and the hollow eyes would haunt him forever. And he knew one thing for certain: the school was still waiting. The deserted hotel, room 300 in SIX's last guest. Nestled far from civilization, hidden between the windswept dunes of a vast desert, stood the once glorious Oasis Hotel. Years ago, it was the pride of the region, attracting travelers with promises of comfort, luxury, and a perfect retreat. But over time, whispers about strange occurrences began to circulate. One by one, guests vanished, and the hotel's vibrant charm decayed. Now, the hotel remained abandoned, its windows cracked, its walls covered in dust. The only sound that echoed in the halls was the faint whistling of the desert wind. But on one fateful evening, a lone traveler arrived at the hotel. His name was Richard, a weary man in his mid-30s, exhausted from his long journey across the arid landscape. Seeking shelter for the night, he had little choice but to enter the deserted building. The front desk was empty, and the air inside was musty, carrying the staleness of abandonment. Yet, he pressed on, hoping to find a room. The hotel's clerk, an elderly man with hollow eyes and a trembling hand, appeared from the shadows. He seemed surprised to see anyone, his voice barely audible. "We don't get many guests anymore. But if you must stay, room 306 is available." Richard, too tired to question, accepted the key and made his way upstairs. The staircase creaked under his weight as he climbed higher, the air growing colder the closer he got to room 306. He reached the door, which seemed oddly heavy, as if it had been sealed shut for years. When he opened it, the room felt strangely pristine, as though it hadn't been touched by time at all. The bed was made, the curtains drawn tightly, and a single lamp flickered dimly in the corner. Richard settled into the room, unaware that this was not a normal hotel stay. As night fell, a strange sensation crept over him. The silence in the hotel was deafening, unnerving. It was as if the walls themselves were listening. The hotel, though empty, felt alive with an unseen presence. At midnight, he heard it, a soft knock at the door. At first, he dismissed it as the wind, or perhaps his mind playing tricks on him, but the knock came again. 3 sharp taps. Heart racing, Richard slowly got out of bed and approached the door. His hand hovered over the handle, hesitant. When he opened it, no one was there. But the hallway seemed darker now, and the temperature had dropped. Confused, he closed the door and returned to the bed, trying to shake off the feeling of being watched. But the knocks continued this time, louder, more insistent, echoing through the walls of the room. Richard's mind raced. He had to leave. But the door refused to budge when he tried to open it. It was locked, impossibly locked from the inside. Panicked, Richard backed away from the door. The flickering lamp cast eerie shadows across the room. Suddenly, the air seemed to thicken, and a low, guttural whispering filled the space, like voices murmuring just beyond his hearing. "Leave this place." The voices grew louder, more distinct. It was a language Richard couldn't understand, yet somehow, he felt as if they were speaking directly to him. Then, a cold gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the lamp. The whispers grew into screams. Out of the darkness, a figure appeared, a tall, shadowy form, with hollow eyes and an ethereal presence. Richard could barely make out its shape, but its aura was undeniable. The figure slowly advanced toward him, its feet hovering inches above the ground. The air seemed to press down on him, suffocating him. "You shouldn't have come," the figure whispered in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "Room 306. The last guest always stays." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. Desperately, he tried to force the door open, but it was no use. The figure reached out with icy hands, and Richard felt the life drain from him, his limbs growing heavy as if the very essence of his being was being pulled away. The room seemed to stretch and distort, the walls closing in. The figure's hollow eyes pierced through him, as if it knew every fear, every regret. Richard's vision blurred, and he found himself drowning in an endless sea of shadows. The whispering voices swirled around him, each one telling him stories of those who had stayed in room 306 before, their souls forever trapped, unable to leave. Suddenly, Richard felt a jolt, his body snapping back to reality. The figure was gone. The door was wide open, and the room was empty, save for the faint whispering that still lingered in the corners. The air felt thick, as if something had shifted in the space between the physical and the supernatural. He stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for breath, his pulse racing. The hotel seemed different now, darker, more oppressive. Every step he took felt heavier, as though the very ground beneath him was resisting his departure. The walls seemed to stretch and distort, as if they were closing in around him. His surroundings were shifting, warping, and for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still in the hotel or somewhere else entirely. Richard rushed toward the front desk, but when he reached it, he froze. The elderly clerk was there once again, his hollow eyes unblinking. He didn't say a word, but his expression was knowing, as if he had been waiting for Richard to return. "Did you enjoy your stay, sir?" the clerk asked in the same eerily calm voice as before. Richard couldn't respond. He was paralyzed, his mind racing with confusion and fear. He turned to leave, but the door was no longer there. The hotel had no exit. Only endless hallways, stretching into the void. "You have come to understand," the clerk said, his voice softer now, almost comforting. "Room 306 always claims its guest. And once you enter, you can never truly leave." Richard's breath caught in his throat. His heart pounded in his ears. He tried to run, but his legs betrayed him. The walls were closing in, and the whispers, those terrible, haunting whispers, grew louder, more frantic. As he collapsed to his knees, the hotel seemed to breathe around him, alive with dark intent. The clerk stood over him, and Richard realized with a sinking feeling that the elderly man, too, was a prisoner of the hotel, just like him. Trapped in the endless cycle of those who had been lured to room 306, never to leave. The last thing Richard saw before he lost consciousness was the door to room 306 slowly closing, sealing shut with a final, echoing thud. And in that moment, he understood. The Oasis Hotel had no vacancy. It only had rooms for the forgotten.